Last month, a similar missile was intercepted over Riyadh's airport. Meanwhile, a UN human rights spokesperson has said airstrikes in Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition have killed at least 136 civilians in the last 2 weeks alone. Joining me now in the studio, our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons. Now, Rob, the attack that I mentioned, the one last month over the airport in Riyadh, led to strong accusations by Saudi Arabia, as well as the US, that Iran was fueling the war in Yemen. This latest attack likely to intensify the war of words, but is there any substance to the charge that Iran is responsible?
Well, there's no doubt that it will lead to an intensification of the war of words. And only last week we saw the US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, providing what she said was clear forensic evidence of Iranian involvement. She provided fragments from the rocket that was fired by the Houthis at Riyadh Airport on November the 4th. The problem with much of the evidence, though, is that it wasn't conclusive. Most experts said that, yes, it's pushes things further down the road, but leaves unanswered a number of questions, like where did the rockets come from? They could have come from North Korea, for instance. When were they sent? How were they sent? None of these questions were satisfactorily answered, but in a sense, it's almost besides the point, because the key here, I think, is that Saudi Arabia is going to use what has happened, as it did in November, to justify its own narrative about how this war started, who's responsible for it, obviously Iran in this case, rather than to address the original causes of the war. Where did it all start? What are the roots of this conflict? So at the moment, I think we're in a situation where a war that has claimed thousands and thousands of lives, many of them civilians, is going to intensify with neither side, and possibly Iran is involved. The problem is we don't have any clear evidence at the moment, but ultimately, we're in a situation where nobody is going to accept responsibility, and thousands of civilians are going to keep on dying.
Now, Saudi Arabia is trying to occupy the moral high ground in this conflict, presenting itself as the defender of the established order. But the war, as you mentioned, has caused untold human misery and massive damage to Yemen's infrastructure. Is there any sign that this conflict is drawing to a close?
Well, first of all, there is no moral high ground in this war. The Saudi coalition has blasted Yemen's infrastructure into smithereens. What there was of it anyway. It was a very poor country even before this conflict started. But what infrastructure they had, hospitals, schools, roads, bridges, has been all but obliterated. The Houthis, too, have to take their share of responsibility. This is a conflict that's driven by greed, ambition, and corruption. Nobody can claim they've got the moral high ground in this conflict. But as to whether this war is any nearer to the end, the simple answer is no, it appears not. There did appear to be some hopes that when ex-President Saleh was killed at the beginning of the month, that somehow might provide the impetus for an end to the conflict. It hasn't worked out that way. The Houthis seem more entrenched than before. The Saudis seem to sense an opportunity for getting an illusory victory. And the war goes on. You mentioned the suffering of the ordinary people of Yemen. 25% of the population is in danger of one of the worst famines mankind has ever faced, according to the United Nations. 3 million people have been forced out of their homes. As I mentioned earlier, 10,000 civilians have been killed, and no sign that this conflict is going to end.